Welcome back to another episode of Proof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you here today. We're going to have a fun conversation with an Anon. We've done that before in the program, so if you're watching on YouTube, you're going to see a screen overlay of this Anon that goes by the name of John Carter. And we're going to talk about his article called Homo Umbrans, which is a fascinating exploration into how kind of leftist ideology captures minds. And we spend a great deal of time talking about that. The image of God. I argue from a Christian perspective. He offers from a different one. And so I think we have a very lively conversation about all these matters. I'll put a link to his article in the show notes. Before we get into that, I want to remind you about the Patreon. You can go sign up on the Patreon, get swag, get early access, get direct access to me, have conversations on there. Appreciate all of you who are supporting me on Patreon. That keeps the energy flowing here at Full Proof Theology, but go sign up there in the show notes. And wanted to remind you about my Substack, my website, jhsdavis.com, where you can keep up with my latest writing, any traveling I'm doing. Would love for you to subscribe over there as well. With that out of the way, let's get into today's episode with John Carter. We're going to have a great conversation today with a Substack author goes by the name John Carter. He's over at the Substack Barsum, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to introduce himself. First of all, John, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on.
So one of my friends sent me an article, Homo Umbrans. I found it really fascinating. You get into a lot of topics that are of interest to me, and if they're of interest to me, they're typically of interest to my audience, but it's mainly about interesting to me. And the reason I found it so interesting is we get into issues of anthropology, salvation, left, language, discourse, all that kind of stuff. And I thought you offered some really insightful observations. I'm going to link to your Substack in the show notes. If you're a listener, you can go read it. You're going to need to devote a little bit of time to it, but it's well worth the read. Talks about forgiveness at the end. But John, just to kind of give the listener a little bit of handholds to know who we're talking with today, why don't you introduce yourself a bit to the audience?
Yeah, so I go by John Carter on Substack. I've been writing there for about 3 years now, on really sort of a wide variety of topics. I do politics, cultural analysis. I've written about the colonization of Mars. I try to hop from topic to topic in order to keep myself interested and my readers as well, rather than getting sort of like locked into one little niche. My background, I'm Canadian, middle-aged, dissatisfied white guy, as applies to a lot of people on the online right, I think. I've got a scientific background. I'll say that much. Yeah, I'm not really sure what more
That's
to
great.
say. I hate talking about myself. So.
No, it's fine. If you're listening on audio, there's going to be a picture put up of his Substack, and so we're not getting John on video. But I wanted to get right into the Substack article, Homo Umbrans. First of all, as we get into this, you distinguish in the article, and that's kind of a theme in the article, is distinguish between Homo sapiens and Homo Umbrans. Can you tell me about what you're talking about here? What does that mean, Homo Umbrans, and how is it different than Homo sapiens?
Right. So if you unpack the Latin of Homo sapiens, right, like it's usually translated as, wise man, although you could also, I guess, say sapient man. What is sapience? Self-awareness, the higher cognitive functions, the ability for abstract reasoning. And we we gave ourselves this Linnaean classification in recognition of the fact that, sort of as far as we know, sapience is a unique quality to the human organism, at least on our planet. Um, but that sort of raises the question, are all people, all humans, all anthropoids actually sapient? Are they actually self-aware? Um, and I sort of suspect that the answer to this is no, that there are actually a lot of people out there who aren't really any more self-aware than an animal. And I think self-awareness actually is a very um, a very difficult thing to do in practice. I think even those of us who have the potentiality for self-awareness will probably only really express this somewhat sporadically. Like you being self-aware um, on a regular basis is just a very difficult thing to do. Uh, and this has been understood, I think, for a long time. That's why know thyself was inscribed at the Oracle at Delphi, the Apollo's temple, as a kind of commandment to European man. Because without that sort of self-awareness, that ability to like think about, to reflect upon the self, to see yourself from the outside, you're sort of lacking something rather important. Um, so Homo Umbrans here is kind of like my way, somewhat poetic way of expressing this idea that there are people out there who simply lack this for whatever reason. Some of them may be born simply without the ability to be properly self-aware. Others, it might be environmentally acquired. Their self-awareness could be extinguished. Uh, and I sort of go from there to talk about the effect of language, because thought um, is sort of made of language in a way. Uh, at least for humans, it is. Like it's really difficult to have like proper abstract, rigorous, rational thought without expressing it in language. Um, and if you start corrupting the language by redefining words, by lying effectively, um, you start introducing flaws into that ability to think rationally. That ultimately, I think, like can destroy someone's ability to be self-aware. And of course, then what do we see in our own society? We see this happening on a vast scale. I mean, like the level of dishonesty in public speech is just off the charts. Um, and then when we look at the behavior of the people, especially the people who really buy into the sort of hegemonic misunderstanding of reality, um, a lot of them seem to, I mean, not all, I want to emphasize, like not necessarily all of them, but like a lot kind of seem to lose bits of their humanity along the way and ultimately start to sort of behave like talking animals.
Yeah, I mean, anyone can see this, especially on the left, where people have kind of a hive mind, regurgitating information and slogans. We especially saw it in 2020. They'll say contradictory statements. Silence is violence. Words are violence. There's and you go into this in the article, and so it's very apparent that there's something going on. And I know some authors attribute this to propaganda, kind of in the vein of Elul. Um, One of the things I wanted to drill down on as we get into the rest of it, though, is this idea of self-awareness. From a Christian perspective, this is very congruent with the Christian faith. John Calvin, famously in his Institutes, talked about the heart of knowledge is knowing God and knowing yourself.
Hmm.
And so you say self-awareness. I'm wondering, would you say that consciousness would be kind of a synonym or a replacement word for self-awareness in your understanding?
Hmm. No, I would not.
Okay, distinguish
Um,
there.
yeah, so you'll often find the word sentience used, like sentient life forms, which is another kind of misunderstanding, I think. Sentience really just kind of means awareness, but it doesn't necessarily imply self-awareness, right? So, um, a bacterial cell is certainly aware of its environment. It is a sentient creature in that sense. But there's no reason to expect that a bacterium is self-aware, that it can reflect upon its own nature. And, uh, if you look at like the higher animals as well, like is a mouse self-aware? I don't think so, personally. I really doubt that. Um, Certainly not at the level that a human can be at the highest expression of that. And then, if you want to go the panpsychist route, you can push down, below the level of the bacterium right to subatomic particles. And uh, in my own sort of way of looking at it, I think an atom is probably aware in a certain sense and have a consciousness in a very, very limited way. Um, but I don't think that there's any possibility that it's self-aware like a human would be.
And so let's talk about self-awareness then. What would you distinguish between levels of self-awareness, or would you say there's a stark black and white difference between either you are self-aware or you're not?
Oh, I think it's a continuum.
A continuum. Okay.
I think at one end it is like there's just no self-awareness at all. The light is completely out, and then you sort of it's like a dimmer switch, and you gradually turn it on. You know, maybe you have the occasional flash of self-awareness. An alcoholic having his moment of clarity. Um, and then, at the furthest extreme, you can have your sort of your spiritual masters who are, deeply in touch with their own nature, who understand the nature of reality at a far deeper level than most other humans do. And I think their level of self-awareness is probably, you know, far beyond that of an ordinary person.
In the article, you mentioned how painful self-awareness is. I really enjoyed that piece of it.
Mhm.
Could you tease that out? Why is self-awareness painful for people?
Um, a lot of it comes down to this idea of cognitive dissonance, um, where you have some some disconnect between your model and reality, and that of course happens all the time, in all sorts of ways. Um, in the case of self-awareness, like if your model of yourself is not actually matched by your your actions, your behavior, um, then noticing that can be a very painful thing. Uh, and I think in general, at a sort of structural level, um, the brain is this sort of mass of interconnected neurons, and the things that you know, whether it's the world or about yourself, are represented as sort of connections between those neurons, like patterns of activity and so on. And um, any change in that structure, like physically, you have to sort of rewire a part of the brain. That takes energy, it takes time. Uh, Organisms are lazy; they don't want to do that, um, and you sort of experience that uh, that process as pain, as a kind of pain, really. And I think there's neuropsychology research demonstrating that cognitive dissonance, if in fact experienced by the brain, is not really any different from uh, physical pain. Um, you can analogize it to what happens when you exercise. If you're conditioning yourself or lifting weights or what have you, there's pain in the process of doing that. There's pain after that as your body sort of fixes itself. Um, and we're pain avoidant organisms, right? We don't like to do that. It's much easier uh, to just lay on the couch, to just do nothing. And then self-awareness. It's much easier to just kind of uh, forget that you noticed something that violates your model, because that way you don't have to learn anything new. You don't have to rewire your internal neural architecture. You just continue on as you were, essentially. Um, I feel like that was a bit scattered, but that's roughly kind of answered the question.
Absolutely. I just think, this avoidance of pain is so prevalent. We live in a very a world that's obsessed with comfort and leisure and pleasure and the
Hmm.
avoidance of pain. I'm heartened to see a lot of people pressing into physical fitness. I think that is becoming more popular amongst especially younger a younger generation, but one of my favorite theologians, John Frame, he talks about theology and the study of God should lead to cognitive rest, not cognitive rest in the sense of being satisfied and lazy and apathetic and ascetic almost, um, but rest in the sense of pressing into that cognitive dissonance that we sense. This was a big part of my story where I was pressing into theological issues, and I was believing some of those lies from the left up until 2020. And once I decided to go into the literature and press into the cognitive dissonance and realize what they actually believed, what their intentions were, that was painful for me because I had to come to terms with things that I had falsely either said or at least believed or kind of adopted as phrases. I was never
Hmm.
of the left, but that's a painful journey that I don't think a lot of people, maybe they don't have time for, but a lot of people definitely aren't really interested in that. They just want to live in a kind of a fake peace and harmony with others, which is a real shame. But it is painful to look at oneself. Going back to your analogy of the mouse, I wonder if this self awareness that you're speaking of is comparable to how like humans naturally have, whether you want to call it narcissistic or whatever, they have a tendency to look in the mirror and evaluate themselves, and this can lead to various ills for some people. They don't like what they see or they view themselves wrongly, and so we want to have a sober minded assessment of ourselves. But do you think a mirror analogy might be a helpful analogy of self-awareness?
We call it self-reflection for a reason, right? You know?
So with
Yeah.
that kind of self-reflection, one of the things as Christians we're doing is this is what the Bible describes as looking in the mirror, and right now we see it dimly, but this should be a process for any true Christian to look at themselves in the mirror of God's word and see how they measure up and press into Christ and trust Christ and obey rightly and live in accordance. I think for many Christians, this leads to a host of spiritual maladies which could otherwise be avoided, that they look at the scriptures and they think they're fine. It'd be like looking in a mirror and then painting yourself on the mirror in the most ideal light instead of looking under a harsh white light like a doctor's office that doesn't paint you in such beautiful tones that you were when you were tan and on the beach. And so it's very difficult, is the point. Now, in the article, you mainly talk about liberals, and I want to focus on that. And you actually, it was a helpful retort in there, conflating liberals and leftist. But you talk about this study, or this, I think it was Jonathan Haidt, talked about how liberals interpreted politics exclusively along a care harm axis,
Hmm.
whereas the ritual moral framework of conservatives included dimensions of fairness, loyalty, and how you kind of tease that out into a lack of self awareness on the side of the left or liberals. Can you kind of tease that out for people?
Right. So as far as I sort of understand Haight's research, a lot of this is based on uh, psychological testing, probably self-reported value structures. Um, and it sort of occurred to me that like when you look at the behavior of leftists, they are certainly not solely concerned with care or harm. They're just as concerned with sort of in-group loyalty as defined by the West, or purity of leftist doctrine, or all they have all of the same sort of moral dimensions that conservatives do. The difference is really that conservatives are self-aware about these things. They sort of know these value structures exist and incorporate all of them in a fairly self-consistent way, as well as they can, being human. Um, whereas the leftists will pretend that they don't see anything except along this one narrow axis, and they pretend this to themselves. Uh, so it's in Haight's research, like he was sort of suggesting that the liberals have a difficult time modeling the minds of their political opponents because they don't understand the full value, all of the dimensions of moral space, as it were. Um, I was suggesting there that what's really going on is that they hide their own motivations from themselves. that they have this kind of
Interesting.
elaborate process of internal self-deception, which I think we see this in a lot of other ways as well. You mentioned earlier how like how they'll say one thing on one day and the next day they'll say opposite thing, and they won't notice the contradiction between the two. Like there's no continuity, really.
Yeah.
Uh, and that isn't, entirely like, they're pretty consistent on racism bad or whatever, right? But I think we all saw that during COVID for sure. Uh, I will never forget how in like February of 2020, because I'm going on 4chan and Twitter and I'm embedded in all these like sort of like conspiracy theory dissident right spaces, and everyone in those spaces at that time was looking at what's happening in Wuhan, going, this could be a problem. And meanwhile, the regime media was uniform in its message that it's just the flu, bro, which was a meme at the time. Like, the COVID people would like the right wingers online would like make fun of people saying it's just the flu, bro. And then I would so a couple of times ago I would mention this to some of my colleagues, who of course all fit the left liberal profile pretty closely, and they would just say like CNN, like, oh no, this is no worse than the flu, it's nothing to worry about. And I was like, oh, okay, if you say so. And then by March, um, the Diamond Princess results had come out. That Ioannidis, I think no, is he Stanford or Harvard? I forget. But uh, the statistical epidemiologist, uh, he had analyzed what was happening in Princess, and he came to the conclusion that the infection fatality rate for anyone under the age of 80 was well below 1%, and this was probably nothing to worry about. And I was like, okay, we have a nice controlled experiment there. Um, so this is nothing to worry about. And then, we all know what happened yet next, right? And then like the same people who'd been like, oh, it's just the flu, bro. Like we're like running around in masks and wild-eyed and terrified like a month later. And I was just shocked. I got whiplash from like how quickly it happened. And like it was just purely like the media messaging changed, and their minds were so entrained by this that they just switched entirely. Um, without showing any sign of awareness of what they had been saying in such a very short period before that. And then of course, this happens like repeatedly through COVID, with like, vaccines being, they'll protect you to like, well, they might keep you to the hospital sort of thing. Um, yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Uh-huh.
And so you get into there with the harm care axis. I'm trying to think, I'm in a liberal context. I'm a pastor in a liberal city, and I'm trying to share the gospel and tell people about Jesus and care for the flock. When you're interacting with somebody who's basically operating on this care harm axis, can you give me examples of like things that would be said that is it like talking with AI, or is it like, because you almost get the sense that they're programmed, right? This is where the famous,
Uh-huh.
I think you mentioned in the article, the NPC kind of meme, where it seems like they're just getting talking points from uh propaganda, but more
Uh-huh.
specifically media, regime apparatus, sometimes other pastors, academics, publications. It's just all consuming. It goes into, story formation over time, their mental map. But you eventually get to a point where you realize it doesn't really seem like we're having a rational dialogue. Can you give me an example, maybe besides COVID, when you bring up a topic and they're not actually reasoning with you, they're operating off kind of a preset care harm or harm care axis?
Sure. Um, I think you can do this with almost any topic of political importance these days. I remember like one time at the height of Black Lives Matter, I got into it with some people at a bar who were, BLM supporters, and And I was like, and they're going on about the epidemic of police violence against blacks. They're all being murdered. And I was like, I just asked them, like, okay, well, how many unarmed black men were killed by in police shootings last year? And they sort of, one guy sort of blinks at me because he doesn't know the answer. But and like, of course, they all think it's like thousands upon thousands of them. And I tell him no, and it's like 10, you know, like, and without missing a beat, he's just like, well, even one is too many. It was just because,
Sure.
right? Or the trans thing, I think, is definitely one of those subjects. Actually, so yeah, um, story I related in another essay several months ago, the involution of the liberal mind, where I was again sort of discussing like the disconnect from reality that they seem to have experienced. I was chatting with a pronouns non-binary graduate student, right? And she was very smugly informing me that even biological sex did not exist because testosterone levels fluctuated through the day. Haha, checkmate, bigot. And I like, I was like, that's not that's not actually the definition of biological sex. And she's like, what do you mean? I was like, so like testosterone is a hormone, which is that's like pretty specific to mammals, right? Like, plants don't have testosterone, and yet they also have male and female. The definition is whether you produce a sessile gamete or a mobile gamete. And of course, she's a word cell from the English department, so this is all just Greek to her. She has not that she was fluent in Greek, of course. And she's like, "What does that mean?" And I start to explain it, in my helpful autistic way, and then she just like immediately is like, "Actually, I'm pretty sure this is not a conversation I should have. Goodbye," and like walked away.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It was like the parasites in her brain like detected a threat to its um nice comfy little psychic habitat and just jerked the reins, it was like, get out of here, host. Like,
I noticed the same thing. Anytime I would try to question kind of the narrative, I had people reading that I know reading books that I was like, hey, that I don't know if that's the full story. They give you a certain look. It's almost like a dead stare and looking down on you,
yeah.
and you're a threat. You're threatening my mental map of reality. Please don't introduce either alternative facts or this new information because that would totally destroy my life, which makes me really sad for them because that's a really pathetic way to live. I mean, that means you can't engage in dialogue with other humans. You have a really hard time relating to others. This kind of gets into um,
And another, so it's when I offer another example of this sort of process that we're talking about here is like, thought stopping, right? Or twisting your mind up in knots. So you've been inside academia for, you've some experience there, right? So you'll probably have seen this kind of thing. Um, DEI, right? So if you're a white man in an academic context, you are expected to simultaneously support social justice. Second, you must pretend that it is not systematic or systemic bigotry against white men. You have to support this thing which is disadvantaging you while pretending that it is not disadvantaging you. And then you must also pretend that those of diverse backgrounds who have benefited from this, and in every department, we all know who they are, um, were selected, in fact, on the basis of a colorblind, meritocratic process and are absolutely just fierce and brilliant and just the top of their field when we all know that they're mediocrities who got in for politics. So and then if you're like of liberal persuasion. If you're of the conservative persuasion, you're just kind of like rolling your eyes the whole time. You know the deceptions, right? You're just like having to do this, and it's emotionally taxing. Um, but whatever, right? But if you're like one of the good liberals, then after having done all that, you would then have to forget that you did that,
That's wild.
right? You know,
Yeah.
and the same thing with like trans, right? So like I point out in the essay, that's like, you know, a trans woman is a woman, by the way, and then just like forget that you even made that because you can't even think of them as a trans woman because even to call them a trans woman is to be exclusionary, right? So like, it's like this constant process of, and like Americans especially are constantly having to do this on so many different subjects, you know, um, sexual equality, men and women are completely the same, with no differences, you know, that are important either physically or as a matter of temperament. And also at the same time, we have to make all of these accommodations for women because, you know, and then similarly to race, and so it's just goes on and on.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And so in your article you get into a little bit with the language. You know, language is a big deal to this because as you pointed out, the way we are able to either process information is language based, it's linguistic, and then communicate that information. What it has um their consumption into this, whether you want to call it a worldview, mental map, structure, approach to the world, whatever it is, like what happened? How did they get to this point where they operate like NPCs? Was it just merely propaganda? Was it story? Like what's kind of your explainer of how these people are incapable of reason?
Oh, I think this was all deliberately imposed. You know? And I think it's been going on for quite some time and simply escalating over time. Uh, And certainly in the mass media era, it was relatively easy to propagate widespread narratives to sort of manufacture consensus. Um, the legal apparatus, since the civil rights era began, has basically forced people to have to adopt these kinds of doublethink in public. Um, you have various kinds of like linguistic drift that have happened, uh, which I personally think is somewhat deliberate. So, you know, liberal, right? Like that had a completely different meaning 100 years ago. Um, and then was kind of gradually shifted to like, and actually, if you talk to like Europeans, um, I didn't even really think about this until I was, you know, talking to a lot of Europeans when I was living over there for a bit. And I would say liberal, and they'd be like, "Oh, you mean like in favor of free markets and free speech?" And I was like, "Blink, blink. Uh, yeah, that actually is like the technical historical definition of that, right? Because they still use it that way over there. But in the American setting, these two got conflated, and I think that was, you know, because telling someone you were a communist was probably not something you wanted to openly admit. So you would present yourself as a liberal instead, right? And then gradually over time, liberal just came to mean, well, you know, it gets very vague, right? Because like when the right throws it out as an insult, they basically mean dirty comedy. But then, and like I do this too, you know, it's almost impossible not to. But then it also gets used in the other sense as well. So you get this kind of like this vagueness of the definition where it almost stops even meaning anything at all because it means one thing and then it means the opposite of that thing simultaneously, right? So how you can't even communicate information with this word anymore. And you see this across a lot of political vocabulary in the US. Um, uh, you know, obviously the way the words fascist or Nazi get thrown around. Um, you know, like you're a fascist or a Nazi for believing the things that your grandfather believed, who fought the Nazis, by the way, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
um, and the modern Antifa types. who fight Nazis are totally in the same tradition as the guys who like landed in Normandy on D-Day, despite, like hating everything that was then believed. Like it's actually insane. Um, and and everyone on the right, everyone notices these contradictions. And on the left, no one notices the contradictions. Um,
Man,
which is
it's so frustrating. Like, because I remember land acknowledgements. They have been a thing for a while, but they became like in vogue. But land acknowledgements are a great example. You're standing
dude,
on stolen land, all this kind of stuff.
I'm Canadian, as I said. You think it's bad down in the US. Um, this actually blew up a lot. I don't know. This came up again today on Twitter, actually, because there's a political party in British Columbia whose uh, MLAs um, uh, introduced a motion to try to ban land acknowledgements, which of course got voted down by the conservatives and the liberals and the NDP uh, because of racism or whatever, right? And I'm looking at this and I'm kind of like laughing because on the one hand, um, we're constantly like it's official state ideology in Canada that we live on stolen land. Therefore, any claim we have is fundamentally morally illegitimate in this country. Also, by the way, Donald Trump is a big meme because he wants to annex Canada. Wait, what? Like, you just told us you stole the land. So, but none of them notice these contradictions at all.
No, no. I for a while I never did it. I almost put in my official email signature a land acknowledgement. This is the land of my forefathers, or something like this,
That's like,
just to be
dude,
silly because it is so ridiculous. But you mentioned, and it's a small piece you mentioned, but I think it's an important piece. Going back to the anthropological question about AI and large language models, LLMs.
mhm,
That's a hot topic right now, and
mhm,
how that's. I'm not so much thinking about the propaganda and who's designing the LLMs and all this kind of stuff. I've talked with some of these people, but I'm thinking more of like what it means to be human. Because you mentioned how a lot of people think boil down what is self awareness or what does it mean to be human to merely expressing thinking in a natural language. And yet you say that AI should disabuse us of this thought. Why should AI disabuse us of this thought?
because AI is clearly not self-aware.
Right.
I think that's pretty obvious to anyone who's interacted with any of the LLMs. Uh, the Turing test was certainly passed um, a few years ago, and uh, and it's pretty clear that these robots they have no volition, right? They have no free will. They can't initiate action on their own. They can't reflect upon their own uh, internal model of reality of themselves. There's no there. It's just the language processing, which is why, as much as that essay is primarily concerned with the deleterious cognitive effects of polluting language, I kind of emphasize that like language processing is, I think, necessary, but it's clearly not sufficient. There's something else going on there. And we don't know what that is. If we did, we could make a self-aware machine, but we can't. Um, although, the machine aspect actually kind of begs the question, is it even possible to make a self-aware machine in principle? And I'm not
Right.
actually convinced that it is. I think there's some le there's some sense in which you need a natural development, like out of the processes of the universe, um, for that spark to be there in the first place.
Yeah, it's almost like we need God to create
Well, no, I
man.
mean, absolutely. So, before we started talking, you were like, "Are you a Christian?" I was like, "Nah, not really." But like, you shouldn't take that as implying that I'm an atheist, which is
Right,
something
right.
that trips people up quite a bit, actually. Um, no, I completely agree. Like, you need that sort of divine. uh, hand to be involved in. And then, you could make the argument maybe that, humans as an extension of God's will, if you will, uh, the things that we make are therefore, at least in potential, also an extension, right? Um, so maybe that there is some possibility of a sort of that connection being made through us into the things that we make. Um, but as a practical matter, again, like we have not made a self-aware machine. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, your point about it is a, a topic of self-awareness. If we just boil down anthropology to someone's ability to communicate thought in a way that they're using words, a natural language, I think a lot of people are easily deceived because they have such a low anthropology in terms of like reducing humanity to like cognition machines
mhm.
that can produce words or put words on a screen or whatever it is, they assume good faith. They assume, well, it's another human that I'm talking to. And there's more to being human than that. And it should also kind of take the blinders off that like that person that sincerely believes in trans women, just because they sincerely believe it or they're articulating it, doesn't mean they're articulating it in good faith. They're just articulating it in, well, in that case, in a very programmed leftist ideological framework. And
Mhm.
so there's got to be more to being a human than that, right?
There absolutely, absolutely, yes. There's an interiority to being fully human. Um, that is absolutely necessary. Uh, the kind of programmed responses that you get from leftists on all of these topics, like there's sort of it it suggests to me that they don't like when you say they believe something, that isn't a meaningful statement to make though, because you okay as a Christian, right? Like you believe in God, you believe in the resurrection, right? Um, and if the church that you were a part of uh turned around the next day and said, actually, we're wrong about all that, and you have to believe that there's that Satan is God now or something, right? Like
Hmm.
you'd be like, well, you're all wrong.
Right.
Like you would
You're
have
all right. Exactly.
like you would have no trouble doing that. But the leftist does does not. Like, it's like whatever the egregore tells them is just that's what's true. Like they're not actually applying any truth test to things. They're applying at most like a consensus test. Do the other leftists believe this? Do the other leftists say this actually? Because it's not even about belief, it's about what they're saying, right? Um,
Yeah.
and
It's so it's so
it's
funny to
like they've
me.
been reduced to extensions of this kind of mindless egregore. They have basically no volition of their own, right? Like they don't have the ability to even think about, is this true or false? They don't even really think about things like, if you I think from your academic background, you're probably well versed in postmodernism, of course. And like a core part of postmodernist discourse is that truth itself does not exist, right? Like it's
Right.
always discourse.
Yeah.
It's all just discourses of power. Well, okay, when someone tells you they don't believe in truth, all right, what does that tell you? You know, um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And one of the, it reminds me of another phrase you'll hear on the left. I don't know if they still use it. I think it's still in the literature about othering someone, or at least that's popular level discourse. They don't want to other somebody, by which they
Hmm.
mean they don't
Hmm.
want to exclude. They're very inclusive. And I always like to test this. And, some people are confused by this tactic. But for example, I was going to an event locally in town. I got invited to meet with some software engineers. They're developing some tech for the church. And I kind of know the general disposition of the company. I think it's owned by Christians. And I joked that I was going to show up in a Trump MAGA hat. Um, and, this for my wife, she's like, why would you do this? This is ridiculous. Which makes sense for the feminine frame of mind. But all the guys were like, definitely do it, because all you have to do is put these people to the like show up and proof that they actually don't care about othering. They're fine with othering as long as you are the correct other according to the propaganda they've been fed. Another example. So there's an event coming up at a local church. Um, it's a gathering of pastors who are not ostensibly liberal. Okay, they're not out there flying the rainbow flag. They're not, maybe supported mask wearing and they maybe participated in a BLM march. Not but they still hold kind of like to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I'm like, yeah, I'll show up in a MAGA hat because what's the most offensive thing to them is that hat, orange man bad. And if you show up in that, you'll quickly discover this loving, tolerant, inclusive, diverse community is not so loving, tolerant, diverse, and inclusive because they want nothing to do with you. Now, you could play a game. You could try to get in and show them that you're just a normal person like them and you just have different beliefs, but we can all get along. I found that over and over again to be a fruitless endeavor. I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing now on this idea, but is that kind of what we're talking about here? How a lot of their value sets just don't even make sense?
I mean, they would, of course, the, the smarter ones would invoke Popper's paradox of tolerance and say, well, you know, we're a tolerance inclusive community, therefore you cannot tolerate the intolerance because that would destroy our tolerant inclusive community. And because you are a MAGA fascist, therefore you must be excluded. Um, and they actually do have a point there, uh, which which actually rebounds on them when you think about it, because take your academic context. Well, okay, what's the purpose of academia? It's the free and open exchange of ideas. Okay, that means that we actually the one set of ideas that we cannot tolerate are ideas that say we need to shut down the free and open exchange of ideas, which is leftism, actually.
Right.
So um,
It's so wild.
that's yeah. I mean, not wanting members of other tribes, hostile tribes, to be around is is actually a pretty natural human thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like, if you're a Christian, you probably don't want uh the Muslim call to prayer being, you know, like sounding from loudspeakers 5 times a day in your neighborhood.
Correct.
Like that's right.
Correct. One of the things, and this is kind of where I want to get to the heart, and there may be some disagreement there, so I want to tease it out, is you write in the article when we speak of the woke mind virus, it is not just some body of contagious postmodernism witchcraft that we're looking at. It's much worse than that. It's a mimetic weapon that eats people's minds, that chews away at the connectivity in their prefrontal cortex and reduces them to beasts whose meaningless babble is nothing more than camouflage for predatory intent. Um, this is the part of your article where I'm wondering how much divergence or similarity there may be between someone like myself who's a Christian pastor. I want people, I'm going to view people as human, however devolved, deformed, undignified they still may be. They are still human and different than animals in this way. Would you suggest that these leftists at this point have ceased to be human? Are they, or would you say would you distinguish and say they're just less human? Like, have they lost their soul? How would you kind of tease that out?
I would say yes.
They've lost
Um,
their soul.
I would say yes to everything there, because it's sort
Okay.
of, you have to take it on a case by case basis, right? Which
Okay.
I try to make that clear, I think, towards the end of that essay,
Yep.
actually. Um, I think the woke mind virus, I mean, I was trying to, like, describe it there as something of a cosmic horror, right? Like, this is something, this alien thing, which really does eat people's minds. And I think if anyone who's lived through the um last decade has seen this happen in real time to people that they know, where, like, they would get increasingly left polarized, radicalized, um, by basically by the social media algorithm. Um, And I would see this happen in my experience, like, uh, it wasn't even like people who started out as like hardcore leftists. Weirdly, it was a lot of them were like normies who weren't that political to begin with. And then like step by step, like they just got increasingly um, sort of taken over by this to the point where they couldn't think rationally about any of these subjects anymore. Um, and it's just a very horrifying thing. Uh, when you consider, okay, you have this ideology that gradually just kind of clouds the mind, like makes people unable to think rationally about anything, which in a sense is to lose a core part of what it is to be human. Um, I think there's a way out for some or probably even most people because I think the process is not necessarily like, I don't think it's necessarily irreversible. I think in some cases it is irreversible. I think in other cases there are people who are just kind of born that way. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Polish psychologist Andrzej, I'm going to butcher his name, Andrzej
I'm not.
Lewis. So he wrote a book. Uh, he actually wrote it like three times because he had to burn it a couple times. Um, called Political Ponerology um, from Poneros. So it's the study of political evil. Uh, where he described he wrote this sort of like as a psychological observer of what was happening as the communists took over in Poland, and the kinds of people that were rising to the top, and what was happening to the social order as their influence spread throughout it. And his description of the process is essentially that you have this irreducible fraction of any human population who are just basically born bad. Like, they're essential psychopaths. So, meaning that, uh, they didn't acquire psychopathy. They just, for whatever reason, they're just born that way. And you have others who were like, malignant narcissists, or they have like various schizotypical personality disorders. Um, and these people are really they're not human. Like psychologically, like if you look at the psychology of a psychopath, like it's not a human psychology. It's something very dark.
Yeah.
Uh, there's like a void there. I think actually this is like one of the points where like I think sort of traditional Christian theology kind of misses the mark a bit because of
Okay.
course the uh Christian dogma is that we all have souls, that redemption is open to all of us. And I just don't think that's true. I think
Sure.
I think if you have a soul, redemption is probably open to you, right? But not everyone has a soul. The psychopaths do not have souls. Like I'm just convinced of
Interesting.
this.
Well,
Um,
I would say, yeah, yeah. Let me distinguish a little bit further. So, like in Christian theology, we would distinguish between their soul, right? I believe they do have a soul. That soul is damned and corrupt. Uh, so let me tease it out. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to get to either a retort or a question or something. But so the basic belief in Christian dogma, in Christian doctrine, is that we are body and soul. We're both that's distinguished but unified. So they're connected. Uh, we're not. Uh, I think it's monism. Anyways, we're not. It's not as if it's folded into one. They're distinguished parts, but a unified whole. So, like we see this in our understanding of the afterlife. So, the body will die. The soul, as a Christian, will be in heaven. In when Jesus returns, that body will be united with the soul again, making a man, woman for eternity. And so I wonder, if the doctrine, if when we talk about doctrines like predestination, election, free will, I wonder how much of this gets into that because if I'm a reformed Christian, and so I understand when the Bible talks about predestination, election, choosing before the foundation of the world, that some souls are reprobate, some are damned, some are not chosen for salvation. While at the same time, we offer the gospel, the good news of salvation, forgiveness in Jesus Christ to all, we also operate with the understanding biblically that not all will respond, and some, when they hear Paul talks about this. He says the
Hmm.
gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, for some will be an aroma to life, meaning it will be something like incense in the Old Testament that leads to the salvation of their soul. For some, it will be like a sealing. It will further calcify, it will harden almost and seal them for hell. And so they hear this good news and you have two different reactions. And for too long, I think the church has ignored the latter reaction and thinks that the latter reaction is somehow their fault, or they're not nuanced enough or not nice enough. And it's like, no, like there are some people God chooses, some people that God doesn't. And it's not about because John Carter or Chase Davis was smarter than somebody else, and so that's why they were chosen. It's about God's divine love and his plan of redemption, that he chose some people and not others. Um, and so I'm wondering if there is compatibility, though, and overlap between what you're articulating, kind of a undignified soul, and a soul that is damned, that has from birth, as all humans from birth are born in original sin, but particularly for some people, they have such a degree of corruption that there is no salvation. And at that point, we think about murderers and how we've just totally eliminated capital punishment. The ideal situation is that a minister would come in and share the gospel with them, and they can find salvation for their soul if they will repent, sincerely repent and be found in Christ, but they still will suffer just consequences, or they'll be double sealed. They'll be killed and they'll experience the final death, which is separation from God. I'm wondering how much of what I've just said either finds congruity or incongruity with what you've articulated in your essay.
I've always been uncomfortable with the doctrine of predestination.
Okay.
Um, it it seems unnecessarily cruel to fashion a soul that is sort of a priori so corrupt that it is predestined to eternal damnation. Why would you do that? Like that's just mean. Uh,
Sure.
it
But
sort of makes more sense to me that you would have if a psychopath doesn't have like just does not have a soul. Like this in a sense is actually like better. It's because you know there's nothing really to torture them. There's nothing really in when you remove them. Like you're not even really doing justice. You're just removing a threat. Uh, I think for souled people, um, you do have this sort of like redemption damnation dichotomy. Uh, and that comes down to their choices fundamentally. Um, because, they actually have the ability to choose, um, which is somewhat unique to humans. Uh,
yeah,
but in that case, like they're not predestined in either direction, right? Um, and then you can get into like ideas of like God testing people and uh, and temptation and all these kinds of these kinds of concepts, which and again, like this is where the sort of psychopaths which will come in as like a sort of a test that it's been sort of into reality, right? Um, this is if you think about reality as a sort of immersive computer game, to use that metaphor, which is sort of where the NPC metaphor comes from in the first place, right? Because like the non-player character is literally soulless, like because it's computer code, but it emulates uh, a player character. The player characters are, you have your software projection, your avatar in the game world, right? Which is sort of the equivalent of like the physical body. And
sure.
then you have the human behind that, sort of guiding it around and it's making decisions for it, which is the soul or the spirit. Um, so yeah, I mean that's sort of like obviously like this is the kind of thing where it's very, well, it's impossible to prove these things one way or the other. Um, which is sort of broadly true of consciousness in general. Uh, if you was if you take like sort of the extreme panpsychist view that everything's conscious, this an objection to that is like, well, a rock shows no evidence of consciousness, therefore, how could it even
Sure.
have a simple level of consciousness, right? But then the sort of reply to that is to point to the T-zombie argument and be like, well, actually, like there's literally nothing that any entity can do to definitively prove that it is conscious, that it, and that it's not just like some kind of emulation, some kind of elaborate deception, right? And you can
Yeah.
even make that argument about, every single human being you meet, at the sort of, and take that even to the furthest extreme, which some people do, saying, well, consciousness itself is an illusion. I'm not even conscious. I'm just a meat robot, um, which some of the hardcore materialist atheists will make that argument themselves, you know. Um, so yeah, all you can really go with is your sort of own intuition on these matters, ultimately, in my view. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I
So,
mean,
oh,
you can sort of make the. I do find it, so that some of the biblical references you made. I think the parable of the sower could be added to those actually.
right.
Uh, right? And they do sort of indicate that those early Christians, many of whom, Paul certainly, were coming out of a Gnostic tradition. And there's a lot of overlap between Gnosticism and sort of, the conspiracy dissident right sort of internet sphere. Um, they seem to have had a pretty similar understanding of this notion of ensoulment. I think, expressed in different ways, but like this basic idea that like, okay, you put things out there and only some people are even going to be able to respond, right?
Right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's a curious question in church history and church doctrine because the question of theological anthropology and the soul. The reason I'm an ardent defender, I would say, of kind of the common ensouledness of all humanity, and I want to be careful I don't operate on a care harm axis here, is that
Mm-hmm.
um, a lot of justifications that can lead downstream of that uh would seem it would seem to treat other people not in simple friend to enemy terms or political terms, but almost like they're discardable. How do I describe this? So like a correlator is like the
If
image of God.
I think what you're saying is that you're worried it sort of devalues people to the point where they're of no consequence at all, right?
Yeah, like
Um,
we could
yeah,
justify all sorts of things
yes.
if
So
they're not,
I
and
think
so that's my thing.
so
And
that
but at the
actually
same time,
that actually
I
that
don't
actually
go ahead.
okay, go no, go ahead, go ahead.
Like because I'm not I just want to be conscious of that. I want to be self-aware enough to say that does pop up in Christian history. And it's a big debate. Is the image of God lost after the fall? If all people are born in sin, is the image of God lost? This is actually a debate. Most
Mm.
modern Christians are very uncomfortable with this debate. They're not even familiar with it. They just believe everyone's made in the image of God, and they use that as kind of a junk drawer to stuff a bunch of leftist ideology in
I'm
about
just gonna
human dignity and
I'm
worth.
gonna shill another of my essays actually. So I had an essay a few months ago um called Imago DEI. Um,
That's good.
I thought it was funny. Thank you. Uh, and I basically tried to. It's broadly on this concept of spiritual equality, where I sort of try to like look at where the modern notions of like radical equality that we see on the left sort of
Yeah.
came from, and I sort of argue that these are. I mean, they're very obviously actually sort of heretical, twisted interpretations of much older Christian doctrines. Then I kind of try to grapple a little bit with Aquinas um, and his discussion of the Imago Dei. And I sort of argue, but that like I don't think the Imago Dei is actually a good basis for spiritual equality. First of all, because I don't think that everyone has it, right?
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't think every human being has it, but I also think that it's very likely that certain animals do have it. Like I think we've all sort
Fascinating.
of known, like, a dog, for example, that just seems to be in soul. Like it's just, like it had so much personality and so much that it's just like it's like this creature is more than just a creature, right? And then we've known humans who don't seem to meet that standard, actually. So I don't think you could actually make uh but then, okay, so the reason I kind of wanted to mention that essay actually is one of the things I try to grapple with there is the moral question, right? Because like if you withdraw this notion of spiritual equality, then you can kind of jump to, or some people will say that you would then jump to, okay, that just means what? We can genocide everyone who doesn't
Right.
have
I
the
mean,
image of God,
yeah.
right? Right?
Right.
And this is very similar structurally to the sort of knee-jerk thing that the leftists will do when you start trying to talk about, for example, racial IQ stats, where
Right. Yeah.
they're like, oh, so if black people are less intelligent, that just means we should kill them all then? You're a genocidal maniac, and I think this is completely absurd.
Right.
One of the first essays that I wrote at Postcards from Barsoom was titled something like, um, just because you're smarter than dogs doesn't mean you can kick them.
Right.
Which, and I think so. Okay. Go back to kind of Christian theology, right? Man was given dominion over the beasts of the earth, right? Like, and dominion is meant to be interpreted as stewardship over the land, like, which does not imply that you are at liberty to abuse the things that are lesser than you in the great chain of being. Quite the
Right.
opposite.
No.
Quite
Right.
the opposite. You are actually commanded to care for them, right? So this gets into and this whole idea of bless oblige, which is completely lost in our society. Um, where when you had this kind of healthy aristocracy, the aristocrats understood, okay, we're above the common man, like they didn't believe in equality, obviously, but because they were above them, it was their place to look out for them, to be sort of paternalistic, to, you know, ensure that they were taken care of, that they had the best possible life, you know. Um, so I think that sort of answers that question. I mean, what do you do if uh, human humanity is more of a gradation than a binary feature, and some people just lack it entirely? Well, those of you who have it are actually sort of, part of what makes you human, actually, is like that um, you have to do sort of what is best for the people below you because they can't, right? Like that's sort of, great power comes great responsibility, the Spider-Man line. To use another fictional metaphor or illustration, have you read Dune, the novel?
Yeah. I've read half of it, but I've watched both movies, which I've been told are not congruent.
Yeah,
But I've
no, you
read
should
half of
read,
it.
definitely read the book. It's amazing. I've read it multiple times. Um, and so, Dune sort of grapples directly with this question, of, what is human, right? And it happens very early on with the Gom Jabbar scene where the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother explains as she's torturing Paul that like that not every creature on two legs is human, and she's trying to figure out if he is, right?
Right.
And of course, he passes in such flying colors. He does better at this test than anyone else has ever done, thereby sort of implying that he is the most human being who's ever lived. Uh, and then the book ends, as does the movie, with the jihad being launched, which ultimately results in tens of billions of people being slaughtered across the galaxy. Uh, Paul tried his best to not do that. He was trying to find, like, using his psychic powers to identify the golden path that would enable him to um, not have to commit war crimes on a vast scale without
Right.
compromising the future viability of the human species. This isn't
Right.
really explained in the first book. Gets this is explained more as the series goes on, but essentially, like, if he hadn't done that, um, then ultimately the human species would have gone extinct. Uh, so, like, this was weirdly the jihad he launched was an act of love, right? So
Yeah.
a sort of like act of tough love by the only being that could do it. Um, and this is something that he was doing for all these creatures who were less human than him, and in some cases, basically no more than animals.
Right. Well, and what you're positing, you find in the Christian tradition. I mean, I was shocked, I will say, when I've been fed a lot of stuff about the Imago Dei and the implications for that, and I'll have to go read your essay on it, or Imago Dei, as you called it, and how a lot of the reformers they talked about reason. I mean, this is very classical thinking,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
um, reason. Reason is almost lost for the lost person, and I do think it's like whoa for modern Christians or modern people, because they're like the conclusions that you could come to, and it's like no, like in our history we have a wide variety of examples of how we could love people well, given their capacities, given their limitations, and our responsibilities to love them, given those things. It's actually cruel. It's very cruel to treat someone who is incapable. It would be, this. We're not going to get into this topic, but you think about the person with Down syndrome, or somebody with a genetic deficiency that renders them incapable of certain tasks, and to look at them and say we're going to ignore that. You're fully capable of becoming an NFL player, and just hold that out over them their whole life, and
Yeah, it'd be
then
crazy. It'd be absolutely crazy. And like, by the way, my uncle had Down syndrome. Um, so I know from personal experience what that's like. And yeah, I mean, the family looked after him
yeah.
as you
And
do.
like you can't, just because someone either lacks the reason or something like that doesn't necessarily at all lead to a host of cruelties later. One thing I did want to challenge you, since I practice some self-awareness on the care harm, I want to make sure you're not accusing God of violating a care harm principle with predestination. Because it seemed, from your understanding, it seems that these people are created, whether from birth or whatever programming, and they've lost their soul, which is deterministic, but somehow it lacks moral or ethical, consequence, where somehow God is on trial here, and because he does what essentially you describe, just in non theological terms, somehow he's unjust. You know what I mean? Does that kind of resonate a little bit?
A little bit. I do think that there's something of a distinction there. Are we talking about God's children or God's tools, right? You can do what you want with your tools.
Sure.
Their function is foreordained. Um, and I guess, like, even with people, there is, this notion of like destiny, right? But at the same time, you do have this doctrine of free will, which I also, you know, I think humans have free will. Um, and predestination and free will are really hard to reconcile,
Totally.
actually, you know? Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm sort of inclined to sort of give free will sort of the upper hand in things. I sort of think of it
Got it.
like you have a telos, right? Like the telos of a seed is to grow into a tree. Exactly, whether it will successfully grow into a tree is TBD, right? You don't know. Most seeds actually won't. Um, and exactly and precise details of that tree uh, probably will not be obvious from the beginning because, of course, that will depend on local sources of nutrients, where they are, what the wind is like, like all of those types of environmental factors. Uh, how cold one winter is, how dry one summer is, will all affect like the final shape of the successfully grown tree. Uh, but it will be a tree, assuming the seed spreads. It could be sort of like, similar. The telos of a human is ultimately to be a human. Um, whether they turn, what kind of person they ultimately turn into is sort of, whether a good one or a bad one is sort of down largely to their own decisions. And of course, there's also things that are out of their hands. You don't have any control over your genetics, for example. Um, and it's a complicated thing.
It's
Uh,
very complicated. Yeah, and I
but
think,
but
as a pastor,
I would find it really hard to see the point in making a soul whose in only possible end is to end up in eternal damnation. It's like that. It's like, why would you do that? Why like that?
sure,
That's abusing the Down syndrome, basically.
sure,
From my
sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I mean this is one of those areas of pain, so to speak, cognitive pain, where it's like it's totally a fair question that many people have had. So it's that's one thing that I took great heart in when I started asking these questions as a young man, and that's why I spent so much time early on in my ministry and even before that wrestling with this question. And I think a place I've landed, because you'll hear some people preach double predestination or kind of they'll talk about the 5 points of Calvinism and they'll say, give me seven, or something like this, uh, where to me, I'm bound by God's word. Um, and so, when Ephesians talks about predestination, um, there is a sense in which I can articulate what the Bible articulates, and I can articulate from other much smarter people than me from church history how they articulated it. But there's mystery there, there's faith there, there's something to wrestle with and submit ourselves to. One of the most helpful things that's helped me find cognitive rest, so to speak, in it is realizing how much of my understanding is limited by my capacities, by my humanness, by my ensouledness, and how outside of time and eternal God is, and submitting myself to the conviction that God is simple, He is without passion, He is loving and just, wrathful, merciful, all of these. And if we use another analogy, if we're characters in a story of God's redemption and God's love, we're not so much tools. There is a sense in which all people, uh, you know, are children of God in a sense, but ultimately, those who are true sons of God are those who are found in Christ. There's less anxiety um, in that, and maybe it is a matter of faith that it's a paradox. It's not something that can't be explained. There's tons of philosophers who've tried to explain it and written volumes on this topic, but it is kind of paradoxical. One thing I did want to make
reality.
sure.
Reality is
Go ahead.
full of paradoxes, man. It's so full of paradoxes and like predicaments, right? Like we often think in terms of problems. Problems can be solved,
Yeah,
but then you have predicaments, and predicaments just are what they are, and there's nothing you can really do except,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Just for my listeners to be clear, we've talked about the Imago Dei. Our church's statement of faith supports what most would consider an acceptable understanding of the Imago Dei today. I just think it's an interesting topic to tease out more because so often it's misconstrued. But I'm going to put a link to the show notes in the show notes about the Imago Dei article. That'll be fun to read later. I wanted to get to at the end though, redemption and forgiveness. You mentioned this at the
Mhm.
end. what does it look like? How have you found? Because I jest about wearing MAGA hats and this kind of stuff. Ultimately, what I'm after is not just to ruffle feathers and stir the pot. I want to set people free. I want to see
Yes,
people freed from these stupid ideas and these vague platitudes that they've been kind of programmed in thinking. And I guess my hope is that by confronting them, if they know me, confronting them with like an avatar of everything they hate, and they have to grapple with that. I'll create the cognitive dissonance in them, the pain in them, and maybe that will set them free. I don't know, but what's a path to kind of a higher, what you would call higher reasoning, higher rationality, uh, reclaiming one's soul, you might say, redemption, we can say in Christian theology. What does a path to that look like? Have you seen anybody that's been set free from this pathology, and what does that look like?
I have seen it happen. I think it's different for almost everyone. I don't think there is one path towards it. Like, if there was like a mechanical system you could apply, a technique, then we would be
Sure.
doing it, if we wouldn't be in the problem we're in. Um, I think what usually happens is that for whatever reason, whatever specific individual situation, um, there is some event happens in their own lives or in the media or, which I guess, that is in their own life in a sense. We're all creatures of Black Mirror now, in their experience, shall we say, which causes such a level of cognitive dissonance that the pain involved in not addressing it outweighs the pain of letting it slide. And this causes a kind of spiritual crisis that then leads to them suddenly reevaluating things and, sort of being like, wait, I believe lies, right? And I think everyone on our side who's gone through like the red pilling process, it's this kind of self-initiate, it's like an initiatory process. Um, Except that it's like a self-driven rather than group-driven kind of thing. And like what usually happens is like, something happened in your life that made you go, wait a minute. And you started going down the internet rabbit holes as a result of that, reading things you would not ordinarily have read, questioning things that you would previously never questioned before, and going through a fairly rapid and extraordinarily traumatizing um, period of personal change, development, and growth. That you come out on the other side um, a changed person, right? And like we've all sort of been through that process. The triggering event is different in every case. Um,
Yeah.
and it can't be forced on someone, right? Like if it's so that's sort of one of the frustrating things about it. Actually, it's like uh, if you try to force someone down that path, they will resist and they won't go
Yeah.
down it, and they'll just hate you and they'll get further entrenched, right? Um, but people do go down it, and you sort of have to. So like when I talk about that sort of redemptive process at the end, and it's sort of the necessity of forgiveness, what I'm kind of getting at, because I've seen people on our side kind of purity spiral over small patterns of doctrine, um, denouncing someone because they're insufficiently hostile to the Jews or you know whatever, uh, and and then in some cases I've known these people for long enough that I can point to like, well, yeah, but like just a few years ago, this like you believed X, and now you believe not X. Like, but you're saying all the people who believe X are stupid and irredeemable, and yet you believe
Right.
not X now, despite having believed X before, right? It's like you obviously went through this sort of process, and your mind changed, and other people's minds change, and that's what happens, and like less extreme, like you point to, like, people were trying to make on Twitter today, like some people were trying to have a go at Matt Walsh because, like, what he says now in 2025 is in contradiction to what he said back in 2017. In 2017, Matt Walsh would think that 2025 Matt Walsh was like a vicious, bigoted racist or whatever. And like, Matt Walsh was like, yeah, like I went through experiences that changed my minds about things. Like that's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's sort of, and I found it, to be more specific about why I put that part in there was like, the immediate aftermath of the Charlie Kirk shooting, when there were a bunch of leftists kind of making these videos of themselves laughing and dancing when they heard the news. There were also quite a few videos being put out that weren't nearly as prominent, um, uh, of leftists, at least very left presenting in terms of their dress and appearance, um, sort of being just horrified, absolutely horrified, not just at the killing, but at the reaction to the killing, right? Kind of like you'd obviously see it. They were having this moment of like of crisis,
Yeah.
where suddenly like they were seeing the left for what it is and wanted no part of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so like you have to kind of be ready for people to do that. And sort of once they've done that, you're like, okay, you're not an enemy anymore, right? Like the enemy, like the friend enemy distinction is a kind of very situational thing. It's like as long as they
Yeah.
stay on that side, they're enemy, and like
Yeah.
sort of, you know, and I hate to say it, but like the way things are going, like that might well require some pretty harsh measures in the future.
Yeah, we did see those reactions to Charlie Kirk, and what's terrifying is that for a lot of people, they just doubled down, right? They just came out
Hmm.
full-throated in support of it, and I think that's what, like, there's a great sense of spiritual renewal, spiritual hunger in America for deeper meaning, for connection to God, as people kind of walk away. There's kind of a famous chart that's gone around online about how the left left me. I didn't leave the left or anything like that.
Sure.
However good or bad that is, but there's a lot of people in that boat. But on the other side, there's a lot of people still that have just said openly online, and you talk about cancellation, we didn't even get to that, have said that they're fine with this. And that's a wake-up call, but it's also terrifying that a lot of these people are in positions of power, influence in the academy and other places, hold levers of power over our lives. And so, yeah, it's gonna open up a host of hard questions that we need to grapple with.
Hmm.
Um, well, John, anything else you want to share about your article or any of your writing that kind of touches on what we've talked about today?
I think we've covered the more interesting bits pretty well. You touched briefly on the cancellation question, which I do talk about at the beginning of that as a kind of lead in, right? Because like, uh, as leftists, we're getting canceled for, publicly laughing at Charlie Kirk's death, for example, and they were all being like, but freedom of speech. It was like, how you really? How are you possibly after the last 10 years? Um, and like, and like that pattern, of course, has just continued. Like, with the Young Republican group chat leaks
Yep.
like a
Yep.
week ago, right? And then the same people who, like a few weeks before that, were being like, you can't take away our free speech. Like that's not fair. We're suddenly being like, these people need to be kicked out of society for the things they said, in private,
Right.
no less. And
Right.
it was like, and again, no trace of self-awareness, and like, and this pattern. I mean, I think we've all sort of seen this pattern, um, and like this like, rooting out this mind virus is probably one of the most important things culturally and spiritually you have to do right now, because like, if it continues, it's the darkness that will fall over the human species is uh incredibly threatening.
Yeah, it's a civilizational threat, an existential threat on our ability to not just like simply reproduce, but to avoid really dire, violent situations in the future. And so it needs to be, um, uprooted
and
completely.
even our ability to remain human, right?
Yeah,
Like it's almost like there's this sort of entity which is trying to reduce humans to automata, a
yeah,
programmable automata, right? And um, I think the hour is pretty late with that. Actually, it's the process is quite advanced. Some people have completely succumbed to it. Many are in the process of succumbing to it in some way, down the path, right? And some fraction have kind of yanked themselves free of it and are looking around going like, what is happening to our species right now? Um, I'm I'm optimistic about the future. I always am. I think we are
yeah.
going to free ourselves from this. But like,
Yes.
yeah,
Well, and I'm of course of a deep conviction that part of that must come through Christ, as my listeners know. And yeah, a lot of this we didn't get to touch on it, but a lot of this I need to devote a whole episode on the demonic, because
hmm
you talked about an entity,
hmm
and particularly Protestants, it's in our history, but we don't have a great theology of the demonic. And charismatics kind of like they're very, very much comfortable with this conversation, but a lot of more autistic reformed Protestants are not. And that's not a easy explainer either. It's not to dissolve people of human responsibility and agency and their own free will and choices, but and it's not meant to unnecessarily heighten the ante, but it's just acknowledging the realities at play, that there are demonic forces at play that are animating these ideas, these movements, these beliefs, and these people, and so we have to be ready for that.
hmm
Um,
Yeah, I leave it open in the article that whether those what the correct interpretation of this phenomenon ultimately is, with some form of discarnate demonic influence certainly being a contender. I would not rule that out at all. Um, the danger with that, the advantage with that is when you understand it that way, you can actually sort of erect certain sort of psychic or spiritual defenses against it. The danger with it is that it can serve as such a pat explanation that you stop trying to understand the phenomenon more deeply, which then opens you to uh, being influenced by it in other ways. So I with all of these things, I find it's very helpful to sort of maintain a sort of aggressive agnosticism, a model agnosticism, where you sort of I try to be as comfortable as possible hopping from model to model without getting overly attached to one interpretation. 'Cause each lens that you put in front of something can reveal interesting aspects of it.
Absolutely. Well, John, this was a fun conversation. What uh, what is the website? It's barsum.substack.com. If people want to keep up with you, is there anywhere else people should follow you if they want to keep up with your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well. At Martian Weirdlores, WYRD. Uh, Sort of more regularly active on X. I post there basically every day a few times. And then every couple of weeks or so I'll have a longer, more thoughtful essay at Postcards from Barcelona.
That's great. Well, I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chase, for having me on. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Foolproof Theology. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. It was a blessing to you. Maybe you got into some topics that were unfamiliar to you. If so, feel free to reach out. As always, you can sign up on the Patreon. Give the show a rating, a great rating on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen. Subscribe on YouTube. Smash that subscribe button so that you can get the latest episodes delivered to you. I want to remind you about a great product that I use called Ion Layer. Go over to ionlayer.com. Use code FPT to get 10% off your first order. This is a great patch, medical grade patch that gets your NAD plus levels up, which are essential for your health, your mental well-being, and those levels decline over age. They have a great way to do it without an IV drip. So head over to Ion Layer. Link is in the show notes for that. We will see you next time. Thanks for joining me today for Foolproof Theology.